What's it worth? What's it worth?
Welcome back, everyone, to the Total Innovation Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Simon Hill. Here is the uncomfortable thought to begin with. A good portion of what you know already is out of date, not because you were careless, but because the facts have a half-life. The things you learned, the certainties of your field, the numbers you quote with confidence, they decay slowly and quietly at a rate you can almost measure, and nobody sends you a notification when they do finally become irrelevant. Today's guest has built a career on that idea and on the larger argument that follows from it. If knowledge expires, and if the systems we have built have grown so complex that no single person can hold them in their head, then the expert is no longer the safest person in the room, a topic many of you will know I hold dear to my own heart. The answer to a hard problem is far more likely to arrive from somebody or somewhere that we never thought to look. And that is a thesis I've spent much of my own life testing in the real world. And today's guest has spent his time proving it, not just on the page, that might be cruel, but across 3 remarkable books, from the decay of facts to the limits of what we can comprehend, and to the strange and beautiful logic of code itself. He is a complexity scientist, easy to say, a writer, the scientist in residence at Lux Capital, and one of the most enjoyable minds you'll meet on the boundary between science, technology, and the things that we don't yet quite understand. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome Samuel Arbesman to the Total Innovation Podcast. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a very kind introduction. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I work hard on those intros. People tend to love them, but they're all true, right? This is you, or at least the you that I saw as I researched and got to know you in the build up to this. Let's start then with where your work first caught my attention, and I do love the book, The Half-Life of Facts, for all of its, it captures you at the title, which is always a good start for a good book as well. For someone hearing the phrase for the first time, what do you mean when you say that a fact has a measurable rate of decay?
Yeah, that is a great question to start with. The way I kind of think about it is, and if you take the idea of just the half-life, which is by analogy with like radioactive materials and radioactivity, in the realm of radioactivity, if I gave you a single atom of uranium, let's say, or some other radioactive material, you can't actually predict when it's going to decay. It might decay in the next fraction of a second. You might have to wait, I don't know, millions of years or whatever it is, depending on the material. But it's very unpredictable. But if I gave you many, many of those atoms, if I gave you an entire chunk of uranium, for example, suddenly then that unpredictability actually becomes remarkably predictable. You can actually say how long it will take for half of the material to decay. You can draw out this nice curve, and you can actually calculate this half-life, which means and so even though I can't predict which specific atoms in that half are going to decay, I know overall the shape of the decay. And the idea behind the half-life of facts is that there is a similar kind of pattern to how we think about the change in knowledge, which is, even though it might be very difficult for me to say, oh, this fact is going to be overturned in the next 6 months, or we're going to learn some new discovery in this field in some amount of time, there is an overall shape to how knowledge grows and changes. And so the idea is that, yes, it's on the one hand, it's true that maybe some of the things you learned in school when you were younger, or that were in your textbooks, are no longer true. And that can feel a little overwhelming. But underneath all of that, there are these regularities, and there's almost this like mathematical pattern to how knowledge grows and changes, how errors are rooted out, and how knowledge actually decays over time. And so that was kind of the analogy, the hopefully productive analogy in terms of how to think about the half-life of facts and the half-life of knowledge.
Yeah, I love it. And as I said, it kind of grips you at the point there. And that half-life analogy that you drew on there is obviously where people's minds go, but in a way it's a good anchor, but it's almost more profound than some of this thinking as you start to explore it as well. Often when we do this, it's good to do it through examples. So can you share some of your favorite examples that you uncovered of maybe facts that flipped, or that people are most surprised to learn that that maybe were once thought of oppositely, or others?
Yeah, I mean, so in one example, I think it might even be like in the very beginning of the book that I give is so my grandfather, he was a dentist. He lived to the age of 99. And he when he was in dental school, I believe it was in dental school, he actually learned the wrong number of human chromosomes that are in a cell. He actually learned 48 instead of 46. And it turns out that there was this period of time, I think it was about like 20, 30 years or so, between when we could like actually image the cell and actually like count these, but not necessarily count them accurately. And so this wrong number kind of made it into the textbooks, and was something that was not just at the frontier of knowledge, but was being taught in medical and dental schools and part of training. And it wasn't until I think the mid 1950s that a better imaging technique was developed and people actually recounted and said, oh, wait a second, there's actually only 46 chromosomes in a human cell instead of 48, which is kind of wild because you think, okay, that's a pretty like basic thing. But I mean, so there's that. And actually related to medicine, I feel like medicine is one of these areas where you see so much of this kind of thing happening, because there's new techniques and new technologies that are used or new treatments. And so my father, he's a retired dermatologist, he told me this story that when he was in medical school, a professor of his used the same exam, like with the same like multiple choice questions and answers. And one year, one of the choices on one of the questions was correct, and the next year, a different answer in the same multiple choice thing was correct as well, or a different one had become correct. And so there's just kind of this constant churn. Similarly, of course, I mean, there's like the well-known example of like Pluto being demoted in, I guess, 2006 or so. But the truth is, that even wasn't the first time that we had had a similar kind of thing. So it turns out in the 1800s, when the asteroids of the asteroid belt were first being discovered, the first few that were discovered were much larger than the other asteroids. And I believe there was actually a little period of time where the like Ceres and some of the other large asteroids were actually considered to be planets. And there were charts of the solar system where those were listed as planets. And so in the same way that, I mean, several generations of students learned Pluto as a planet and then it kind of got demoted and they had to kind of contend with this change. There was a similar kind of thing where I think a generation of students in the 1800s also learned the wrong planets. And of course, there's things around, I mean, what dinosaurs look like and how we think about it. Are they kind of these like slow gray-green reptilian monsters that are cold-blooded, or are they actually warm-blooded and kind of fast and colorful and have feathers? And there's all these different things that have changed over time. And so there's this constant churning of all these different facts and bits of knowledge.
Yeah, I love the Pluto example because I have two kids, so 9 and 7, and my parents are those parents that have still retained lots of things from when I was younger. And so I was back at my parents' home and I found this old book that I had as a kid about space and everything. And yeah, in there we have Pluto and the kids are like, that's not a planet. I'm like, what do you mean? I learned from them that it's not a planet anymore. I'm like, all right, wasn't paying that much attention for that number of years, clearly. So
the interesting thing with that one is I think a lot of kids and especially even like college students, like they know something is up about Pluto because oftentimes the teachers who taught them about the solar system still kind of have this like residual, like because they're a little bit older, they probably learned about Pluto as a planet and they kind of still have this like residual feeling of like, oh yeah, like it still probably should have been a planet, but then it got demoted. And so many kids, if you talk to them and you ask them about Pluto, like some are like, oh yeah, it's like it has like some other categorization or whatever it is. But other ones are like, there's something up about Pluto. Like we don't quite know what's going on there because there's kind of this almost like residual effect of the previous generations that learned it one way who are still the educators. And so so when they teach the younger generation, they kind of include some other kind of complexity there as well, which is and so you can kind of see that even when knowledge changes, it takes so long for things to be to be updated and to really allow the novel information to be able to be integrated.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you and I both, exist in these sort of, frontier spaces in some way and looking at them. And in the book, you draw a distinction between the concepts, I think, of fast facts and slow facts. And these ones in the middle you call mesofacts, if I'm pronouncing that correctly as well, that the ones that change just slowly enough that we never quite notice. And I was thinking about this, a lot of the teaching from business perspective is, and I don't know whether we know whether they're all still facts or not, but the books have been around, we're still learning books from 60s, 70s, 80s, which, may not feel that long ago for you and I, but they are quite a while ago now. As a 70s baby, I don't want it to be that long ago, but it's long enough ago, right? And so how do we know, and what is the concept of these fast and slow and meso facts in terms of, I guess risks as much as anything, right? Because we're putting a lot of faith in the concepts of a fact, particularly in what we're training to lots of people. Some people are deeply critical and cynical. Maybe that's what we call entrepreneurs, but still, like, what's the danger that sits behind it?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about like the rate at which information changes, I mean, right, there's the two extremes of like things that are kind of changing very, very rapidly, like, I don't know, what the stock market closed at or what the weather might be like tomorrow. And you kind of know that, like, no matter what the weather was like a week ago, you still have to look at the new weather prediction because that doesn't necessarily provide that much information. And so we're very good at understanding, okay, when things are kind of changing rapidly, we have to constantly update and actually just look things up. But then you have the opposite extreme, like things that you kind of learn once and you don't have to worry about them changing, like the number of continents or the number of fingers on a human hand. Like, and maybe we'll like define continent a little bit differently, but like the actual physical shape of the continents is not really changing for any appreciable amount of time. And so those things you can kind of learn once, you don't have to worry about them. But then in between, there's this very large range of knowledge that often change, and I talk about it as like this kind of the middle scale, like the mesoscale of knowledge that changes on the order of decades or on the order of a human lifetime. And the problem with that kind of information is we often learn it the same way we learn the facts that we think might never change. And we kind of learn them once, and then the way our educational system often operates is like when you're young, you're kind of this generalist and you're learning lots and lots of different things about lots and lots of different areas. And then as you grow and specialize, you learn more and more about less and less. And you might be updating information in your own field, but by and large, outside of those areas, you're not learning all the things that kind of change at that mesoscale, even though they are changing. And then oftentimes you don't realize things have changed until you're confronted by the next generation who then says, oh, guess what? Like Pluto's been demoted or dinosaurs look completely different or whatever it is. And you're like, what? Like, what happened here? And the thing is, a lot of that knowledge is changing steadily, but you don't perceive it that way. And then you're kind of like blindsided. And so I think actually one of the stories I mentioned in the book is about like some like financier or hedge fund manager who's like, this is like a number of years ago, but it was like giving some talk and said like, oh, like this is true. Like as we all know, like there's only 4 billion people on the planet. And of course, like that has not been true for quite some time. But oftentimes you learn that fact. And so I think I might have learned like 5 or 6 billion people. And of course now that is also out of date. But until you are like, unless you are very deliberately trying to update that knowledge, because of the way we learn those kinds of things and just the way that our educational system is structured, we often, just kind of have the, half remembered facts that we learned that read in a magazine or information that we learned when we're young. And even though these things are subtly changing, we don't perceive it that way. We might perceive it in this kind of much more like stepwise fashion when we're kind of just confronted by some big change, or even worse, we just persist in the outdated knowledge and then make decisions based on those kinds of things. And so that's the reason why it can be, I don't know if dangerous is too strong of a term, but kind of like these are like the riskiest category of facts to kind of handle because they change slowly and steadily by and large, but we often don't update them because we kind of just learn them like once when we're younger.
Yeah, and there's a lot in this, right? And I think also just to set some context, you wrote this book a while ago and people may, like, why are we talking about it now? And I think partly because I discovered it quite recently and wanted to talk about it. Also because your bodies of work kind of flow off the back of it. But it is also just a profoundly, important observation, I think as well. There's real science underneath this concept. But also, there's a weirdness about the things that we say, because once we've established them as new facts, if you like, then it's, the human psyche is often just like, well, of course that's now true, right? And of course it was wrong before. And so how useful is it as a concept, or how maybe the other way around is, how should people be thinking about the utility or the application of the knowledge that all facts have a half-life, but we don't quite know how long that half-life is, and it may be difficult to know when that half-life has been achieved or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of different ways of kind of responding to this information, and to be clear, like, and there's both like the half-life, but then there's also just more kind of larger regularities to how knowledge grows and changes over time. And I think for many people, if they're kind of confronted with the idea of like, oh, scientific knowledge is changing and requires updating, then there's almost this like, I don't know, scientific nihilism, where it's like, oh, like if things are constantly changing, we can't know anything, and they kind of just like, I don't know, throw their hands up in the air and say, it is what it is. Now, of course, that is not really how knowledge works. And I would say part of it, and actually it's encapsulated by this great quote by the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov. Like, so back in the day, I think someone wrote a letter to him and said, like, we used to think the Earth was flat, and we were wrong. And then we learned more, and we thought it was like a perfect sphere. Turns out that's not entirely true. It's more like kind of this like oblate sphere, this kind of crushed sphere. And so therefore, like, how can we know anything if all these things are constantly being changed? And so Asimov's response was, if you think that thinking the Earth is flat is just as wrong as thinking that the Earth is like a perfect sphere, then your view is wronger than both of them put together. And the idea is that, like, yes, we are overturning our knowledge, but it's kind of getting closer and closer to hopefully a true understanding of the world. And we're kind of like sort of like asymptotically approaching what might be a true understanding of the world. And in fact, if you actually like measure out like the amount of error in like the Earth is flat versus what it really is versus like spherical, you can see that we've actually been like reducing the amount of error over time. And I think that's the kind of way to think about that, which is, and by and large, at the core of our knowledge, we like those things are not changing. Sometimes they do change, but by and large, the core is kind of pretty well established. But then at the edges, we are changing what we're learning as we have like better tools and technologies and imaging systems or whatever it is. And the way I think people kind of outside of the field of science perceive this, though, is that everything is changing, because oftentimes when you're learning, like when you're reading in science journalism about article or about scientific advances, that's where the most exciting things are happening. And so that's people would say, oh, like in nutrition, like we thought this thing was healthy. Now we thought maybe it's carcinogenic, and kind of goes back and forth. And people will say, oh, how do we know anything? And the answer is those scientists are all working at the frontier. At the frontier is where there is the most turmoil. But I think the idea behind this is like if we can kind of like internalize the idea that the frontier is where the most exciting things are happening. And that's where there's going to be the most churn. That will kind of provide sort of a bounds on kind of our uncertainty. But I would say more broadly, it requires almost even just like internalizing the idea of what science actually is. Because like science, it's not just a body of facts or knowledge. It's really this rigorous means of querying the world around us. And so therefore, what that means, though, is, of course, things are going to be changing. And you kind of have to, and so science is always like, in terms of like the knowledge, like the facts are always in a draft form. And actually, I even, one of my professors from graduate school, he told me this great story. And I've mentioned it a lot, but I love mentioning this story, where he was teaching a course, I think on a Tuesday, and lectured on some topic. Then the next day, he actually read a paper that invalidated everything he had taught in the lecture the day before. So so then the next class, I think like the following day, like on a Thursday, he came into his class and said to his students, like, remember what I taught you on Tuesday? It's wrong. And if that bothers you, you need to get out of science. And I think there's the idea that like everything is constantly like in draft form. Yeah, we are doing our best, and therefore you shouldn't adhere to some sort of nihilism or anything like that. But holding things a little bit loosely and recognizing that things are in a draft form is a critical part of science. And I think increasingly, as all of us are kind of just confronted with changing knowledge in our own fields or in just kind of things we read about in science or whatever it is, that kind of mentality, sort of the scientist mentality, not the scientist mentality of, oh, here's all the body of science, but the science I have an idea of like there's a rigorous means of querying the world and things are constantly in draft form. I think that's actually really important for everyone to internalize. It's hard. And even among scientists, it's one of these things where yeah, you can talk a good game about this, but like when it's your own scientific research being invalidated or being overturned, then oftentimes scientists will like fight tooth and nail to avoid those things being overturned. But I think by and large, kind of having that perspective, whether just for all the information that you have in your head, I think is actually a really powerful one. Kind of it almost means like we kind of all need to be scientists to a certain degree.
Yeah, everything's in kind of permanent beta hypothesis mode, I guess, is part of the thoughts
Exactly.
on some of that. I want to talk a little bit around identity and expertise as well. So there's a group of folk, and I would put myself in them, and it's a finding at the heart of everything that I do that we work on wickedly complex problems, right? And about 70% of those problems that we throw out to a sort of a broad network of people, human and synthetic, are solved by someone from outside of the domain of that problem space, right? And the broader corpus of that research or the sort of group of people that exists around this would put the argument forward that in those kind of domain areas or those kind of problem types, the specialist is the least useful person in the room, right? Like you want to find other perspectives and other lenses, and the most likely person to solve it is the non-domain expert, right? And there's quite a lot of empirical evidence to sit behind this that generalists outperform specialists in that sort of work. Reading your work, I think you might be in that camp as well, right? It doesn't feel like that would necessarily be surprising research to you. Maybe one, you can clarify whether I'm right in that reading or not, but if a domain's experts facts are quietly decaying, and if the outsider has structural advantage, I'm going to blend a number of questions here. Like, what does that mean for identity and expertise in the world that we live in? Because we place a lot of value as humans on becoming increasingly specialist and expert on specific areas, particularly in science.
Yeah. I mean, so I would say, I feel like it's a little complicated there. Like on the one hand, like I do not want to besmirch expertise. I actually think like an expertise is a very important role. That being said, I mean, as someone who kind of comes from like a very interdisciplinary field, interdisciplinarity and more generalist approaches, like they hold a very like dear place in my heart. And like I actually think like oftentimes we kind of undervalue those kinds of things. And I agree with you that when we are dealing with problems like these kind of the wicked problems you kind of mentioned, or just like engaging with I guess the complexity of the world around us. The complexity of the world around us is inherently interdisciplinary and requires lots and lots of different mental lenses and mental models and frameworks and ways of understanding the world. And so expertise is valuable for maybe being able to provide insight into one specific part of it. But oftentimes the role of the generalist will be, okay, how do I stitch together all these different things? And I would say experts are probably pretty good at avoiding some of this kind of decay, because if they know they're very little subspecialty, maybe they can kind of stay up to date on those specific things. Might be very hard. But at the same time, though, when it comes to solving these problems, and when you have, right, like an expert is not going to be able to overcome, I don't know, jargon barriers or things like that, where oftentimes very relevant ideas and concepts or mathematical frameworks or ideas are that there are important things in other fields, but if you don't even know the terminology of what to look for, you'll just never know them. And so for me, like someone who is a generalist or is more comfortable overcoming those jargon barriers is going to be really, really well positioned for being able to kind of essentially run like an import-export business for ideas, and say, oh, like, here's the thing you're working on. Like, you as expert are thinking about it this way, but guess what? Here's these other areas that are entirely relevant. And of course, like you see this in the realm of science. There's many situations where people have like reinvented mathematical models or other kinds of things like many, many times. Like there was one paper, it's been a while, so I'm not sure I remember exactly, but like, I feel like they looked at the extent to which like some mathematical framework was like reinvented like 8 or 10 times. And I actually remember like when in my own field, back when I was doing a postdoc, kind of like of network science and complex systems, I remember being part of this mailing list. And I feel like once a week someone would say, "Oh, like how do you measure this specific thing?" And then of course like someone would write in and say, "Oh, this has been a solved problem for like 30 years in whatever my field is." And it was just this wild thing of like not even realizing this. Actually, another example of this in my postdoc as well is, so a friend and I, we were working on a certain research project, and we needed some sort of like data clustering technique, and we couldn't quite find what we were looking for. And so we initially were like, oh, we'll just kind of make up, we'll like invent our own technique. It won't be so great, but it'll be fine. And then I said, like, why don't we just talk to like the statistician down the hall? And I feel like within like 30 to 60 seconds, he gave us the exact thing we needed. And it was one of these things where like we didn't even know what terminology to use. Now, it could be with certain AI tools, overcoming jargon barriers is going to be a lot more easy and surmountable. But I still think that more kind of generalist perspective is really, really important in being able to draw and kind of like, yeah, that import export business I mentioned before of like draw ideas from one field and apply it to another one and kind of act as that sort of interstitial role where experts, they do provide a lot of value, but they're not going to be able to do that kind of thing because you need to now draw from so many different domains in order to solve very, very interdisciplinary problems.
Yeah, and for fear of not besmirching experts or others, as you put it, I'm not walking you into a trap there. I think and maybe this leans nicely into the maybe the sort of subject matter, I think, of your second book, right? In terms of some of this, the sort of complexity. I think you overcomplicated was the word or the title that you used. And I very much, anyone working in the broad innovation systems world will be somewhat familiar with this, in that everything has become so complicated and so multimodal, multidisciplinary. I often use the example of, like take something as simple as a pencil, right? There probably aren't that many people on planet Earth who could tell you how to get to this pencil from the raw material in the ground upwards, right? And that's a basic pencil, right? There's lots more complexity from that. And so maybe that's part of the argument we're really making here, right? And that builds into that. Do you want to just talk a little bit about Overcomplicated and what it was saying, and how you think about the world through that lens?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, the basic argument of the book is that we are increasingly building systems, like socio-technological systems, that are increasingly complex, but not just like more complicated and more complex, but increasingly so complex that they are not understandable to the people who themselves built these systems, these technological systems, or the experts who work with them on a daily basis. And going back to what you're saying in terms of like construction and how we build these things, when we are building a very large, complex technology or an industrial process or whatever it is, there are many amazing returns to specialization, like allowing like each person to be responsible for like little parts. And the problem is though, is when all these things are connected together, there is no single human being who understands all the different aspects of it. And the thing is that, of course, like, so the book came out in 2016, well before kind of the current like AI boom. And I feel like I had to kind of make this argument and provide lots and lots of compelling examples to kind of like really bring it out. And now you don't even need any examples. You're just like, oh yeah, look at these AI systems. No one understands what they're doing. They kind of you pour a lot of data in. Maybe the original algorithm is understandable, but the combination of algorithm and training and data, they work, but we don't really understand how. So it's almost this like trivial kind of thing. But the truth is, we don't need to go as far as these massive data centers or AI systems. I mean, if you look at like, I don't know, a desktop computer or a laptop, like these things are also incredibly complicated, and no one person really understands all of the details in all of their complexity. And so the book kind of looks at what are the forces that lead us inexorably towards this kind of complexity when we build systems. And so it has to do with like increasing features and functionality, increasing interoperability and interconnection, having to contend with the complexity of the world around us. Like, for example, and if you want to make like a software app that works for your like is some sort of like calendar application. You can't just say, oh, there's 365 days in the year, done. And of course, because like there's leap years and those things are weird, and there's like different time zones, and suddenly you're dealing with and contending with like the weird messiness of time itself and the world around us, and which means that the software that you're building has to be necessarily complex. And so, and through those kind of forces, and of course, I'm sure there's other ones as well, you end up with systems that get more and more complicated and increasingly incomprehensible because, to be honest, I mean, our brains are not like we did not evolve to contend with things that have millions of interconnecting parts. We can't really hold all those things together. I mean, we can really only hold like a few bits of information in our minds at any one point. And so I kind of look at like what are those, like what are the reasons behind this incomprehensibility? But then also, what do we do? I mean, do we just kind of, and going back to like the half-life facts of like, oh yeah, we can't, like things are changing. Like, let's just throw our hands up in the air in despair. Do we do the same kind of thing when it comes to incomprehensible technologies? And the answer is no. Like there is a wide gap between total understanding and total ignorance. And the question becomes, what are the techniques we can use to query and interrogate our systems to give us a little bit more understanding and kind of move us along that continuum from ignorance to better understanding? And some of them are like, if our technologies are increasingly rivaling biology in their complexity, maybe we can actually take a page from biologists and how they actually interrogate biological systems or ecologies, and try to use those kinds of techniques to understand our systems better. Or understanding various specific like subcomponents, or like what are the philosophical approaches we need to understand things, or like exposing certain aspects of our technologies. Because right now, I mean, most people don't even realize the extent to which these technologies are incredibly complicated because we've been shielded from that. So like, for example, when the Apple Watch first came out, I remember reading some article in, I think it was like the style section of the Wall Street Journal. And it was an article about like whether or not people are still going to wear mechanical watches. And the answer is, yeah, people are going to still wear them. But they interviewed this one guy who was a fan of mechanical watches. And he had this line where he said like, oh yeah, of course I want a mechanical watch. Like I think of like the complexity of the watch, of the mechanical watch, as opposed to a smartwatch, which is just a chip. And I'm like, and yeah, just a chip, but like it's orders of magnitude more complex than the mechanical watch, but we've been shielded from it. And so having ways of allowing people to see the level of complexity and incomprehensibility of these systems, I think can also kind of give us a better sense of these kinds of things. And so, yeah, for me, I mean, maybe this is just because I'm sort of like temperamentally optimistic or happy, but I do think even in the face of these vastly complicated technologies, there are ways of better understanding them. We maybe need to have a certain level of humility about how much we can understand them, but there are ways of kind of allowing us to better understand these technologies.
Yeah, and I think, and again, I think it's somewhat, segues quite nicely into your latest book on this topic as well. But if I may for a second, and I think the analogy, the fact you wrote Overcomplicated in a pre-AI era, quite considerable pre-AI era, and then we sort of draw some of the analogies perhaps to the pace of change and this in some senses very simple UX at the front end of it with all the complexity behind it, and this argument of like these systems are so complicated. I was with one of the founders of one of the large models recently. It's overcomplicated for them. They don't understand. There's so many parameters. It surprises them on a daily basis what it can do. It was Anthropic, and like Claude Code surprised them, right? Like it wasn't a thing that necessarily now became huge. And every day something new surprises them. And so the people building the things, I think that's somewhere where some of the, I guess, concern and worry. And if I lean into your optimism, I'm an optimist as well, right? I believe very much in positive futures, and that we will, whilst there's always a dark side, there's always a very light side, right? And much more glass half full than half empty. Your latest book, I think, makes the case for wonder rather than fear about code, and I guess the broader technology landscape as well. In the context I just set, I feel like the opposite is true for perhaps many people. There's certainly this sort of more fear-based narrative, I think, around the direction of travel as to where we're going. And so we take your concepts of wonder versus anxiety. What does wonder buy versus the anxiety does not at the moment, and why do you place that argument?
Yeah, I mean, so certainly when I think about yeah, the current technological moment, right? There is a lot of fear and anxiety. There's ignorance and there's fear in the face of that ignorance. Like there's a lot of these kind of like very negative emotions kind of all bound up together. And when I think about though, like my own childhood and kind of like early experiences of computing, I mean, there really wasn't any of that. It was much more around like it was like full of wonder and delight. It also didn't feel like computation was just kind of this branch of engineering. It was all like this like very humanistic liberal art pursuit of like connecting to like language and philosophy and biology. But like my own childhood, like it was like my family's first computer was the Commodore VIC-20, and then we had like some early Macintoshes, and like I remember like there was like SimCity and fractals and screensavers and like all this kind of like very exciting, weirdly interdisciplinary kind of stuff. And for me, I I definitely want to rekindle that sense of wonder. It can be a very like, it can be like a cautious wonder and delight because and there are many concerns, and I think a lot of the concerns about these kinds of systems are actually quite valid. But I think when we have a sense of wonder and delight, it's a much healthier way to kind of approach computing. Like it doesn't feel as adversarial of like, oh, it's like humanity versus the machine or whatever it is. Like there are ways of like working together. And in fact, when we look at like complex technologies, oftentimes like when or like these AI systems, when we are confronted with them, we often kind of zoom off to two extremes. Either fear in the face of the unknown and all the unanticipated consequences, or this almost like undue reverential awe of like almost like this like worshipful state of like, oh my God, like the mind of Google or AI or whatever it is amazing. And the truth is like not only are neither of these extremes
two
good,
extremes. Yeah.
they're also not productive because they cut off questioning. If you're constantly afraid and worried, you can't necessarily examine these technologies as they are, which is they're kind of messy things. And the same thing with like this undue reverential awe. It's like these systems, and they're built by imperfect beings. They're built by humans. And like, and so for me, kind of a humble sense of wonder, for me, like not only does it it doesn't cut off questioning, but it also kind of it's probably a much more productive way of actually interrogating the systems of like, oh, these are interesting. Yeah, maybe we can be concerned about these things, but let's keep on learning, like just kind of having a certain sense of curiosity and playfulness. And so like, for example, there was this classic meme several years ago of like how do we kind of think about the like these AI systems as sort of like the Shoggoth with like the smiley face mask, where so like the Shoggoth is like this like hideous Lovecraftian monster, and then like, oh, it has a little smiley face, and like we kind of interact with the smiley face, and we kind of forget that it's kind of this like crazy thing underneath the hood. I'm not sure if like Lovecraftian monster is the right analogy, but if you say, oh, this thing is really, really deeply weird, and yeah, we're kind of interacting it with the chat interface, let's try to peek under the hood and kind of see what's going on there and find all the weird edge cases and messiness. And so for me, I mean, maybe that's maybe for some people that would be horrifying of like, oh, I actually want to kind of understand these things and like realize they're actually much more complex and weirder than they are. For me, exploring edge cases and glitches or unexpectedness, that's the window into learning about these kinds of things. And for me, that's also a sense of wonder. Like, so when I see like glitches and failures, especially when they're not like very dangerous ones, but like glitches and failures that are like kind of weird things that an AI system does, or gaming systems that have some kind of delightful, unexpected behavior. Not only are these windows into how the system actually operates, like, and sometimes glitches are actually the way, like a bug is kind of the way in which you narrow the gap between how you thought the system operates and how it actually does operate. But they also then can kind of provide this like sense of like, oh, delightful insight into how these systems work. And so for me, that kind of like curiosity, wonder, playfulness, playing with these bugs and glitches and this kind of thing, that is a very productive, but also a productive means of understanding these systems, but also feels a lot healthier than kind of the extreme, either negative or kind of like worshipful attitudes that too many people have, because they just don't feel, they don't feel as healthy. And they kind of put humanity very much in opposition to our technologies, as opposed to recognizing, no, these things, ultimately, these systems, they are built by people for people, and we kind of have to find the way in which we can kind of make them work for us in the best way. And I think wonder is kind of the right attitude towards figuring out, okay, how can we kind of make these things be the most exciting for us?
Yeah, I think, and I completely agree actually, but it's that level of uncertainty of having not solid, firm ground under our feet, therefore, right? And going, well, there are shifting sands here, and interestingly, in an agentic world that's kind of built on the truisms of one zeros as well, right? It's like the AI doesn't understand necessarily the construct of half-lives and of truth and fiction in many ways. It's a one zero binary in a number of senses. And yet in the argument of half-life and other things, then one zero doesn't really exist, or if it does, it doesn't exist for very long it exists for indeterminate amounts of time, and we don't know which of those are the determinate and indeterminate times. That could be both a positive or a negative, and I guess you've got to take it on face value and run with the opportunity that gives. But for many people, the idea, therefore, that the ground underneath us is nowhere near as solid as we think it might be on all assumptions, right? They're not one zero, as they are sort of, they're bugs or features, and we don't quite know which one they are yet, is A, quite abstract, and B, quite unsettling, I guess, for, or it might be unsettling for certain people.
Yeah, no, it definitely can be unsettling, and I think partly is kind of just trying to get people to recognize that, like, we've always been to a certain degree on kind of these shifting sands of like levels of understanding or what the current like state of knowledge is. And if we can kind of approach that sort of constant change or lack of complete understanding with a sense of curiosity and humility as opposed to fear, then we still have to confront the world as it is, but and confront all this change. But if we can do it in a little bit more optimistic and positive way, then I think we'll be able to we'll be able to handle it for much longer than if we're just constantly worried at every single moment.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions around AI and the half-lives now. And I before we came onto recording today, I was talking to you about one of these experiments I've just been running with an academic institution I do some work with. And one of the parts of that experiment was more of a less by design in this case, but it kind of led me to this thought for this discussion. We used a model that stopped being trained at the end of 2024, right? So it doesn't know anything absolutely after 2024. And in the concepts of half-life of truths and everything, that gives us a window of 2 and a bit years for things that we know became untrue to test whether the model could predict that truth or untruth or not, right? I haven't actually done that necessarily, but I could do that. It's quite an interesting experiment to go, because my question is going to be, do we think in the age of AI that, and this is going to be too big a question, it's going to be, it depends massively, I guess, context for predicting what you're going to say, is AI going to shrink or potentially extend some of these half-lives, right? Are we, because it may be looking at it from a slightly more constrained through that somewhat specialist lens, even though I know we can build all kinds of personas, but it's built on a trained data set, right? For a variety of reasons. Or is it, is there any evidence that you've seen yet, and maybe you haven't looked at it that closely, that maybe it's going to help accelerate the half-life experience of things? Or are they reasonably set in stone, do you think? We've been through industrial revolutions and digitizations and transformations already, and maybe we've got quicker, maybe we haven't, maybe we can't know, right?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like, I'm not sure I have like a very clear answer or of like which way it's going to kind of go. I would say I'm more interested in the way in which these AI tools, which have been like you've poured in all of human knowledge into these things, or we'll say a very large subset of human knowledge. It can hopefully, and we were talking earlier about sort of like the import-export business of these ideas and overcoming jargon barriers. I think that will rapidly collapse the amount of time ideas can be kind of in some subspecialty or some specific field without like diffusing into the kind of the larger body of knowledge. I think AI will kind of help allow things to hopefully spread and be useful much more rapidly. And maybe I'm being like overly optimistic or overly naive, but that might not necessarily shrink the half-life of knowledge, but kind of but accelerate the speed with which ideas that are already exist can actually be productively used in other fields. So I think that will be a boon for science and innovation. But yeah, how it kind of changes at some of these kind of half-lives. I'm not sure. I mean, I can definitely also see kind of like the negative version of even when things are overturned, if people are kind of living in their own like little like filter bubbles or whatever it is, or kind of AI like just kind of like reinforcing whatever they think, yeah, then they kind of constantly kind of have outdated knowledge. I don't think the AI systems are doing that. I know this is now I'm just like speculating kind of.
No, I mean, this is definitely sort of predictive stuff, right?
Yeah,
And
I don't know.
guess
So I don't know, but I do think in terms of like helping with that import export business, it's going to be very valuable.
Yeah. As I said, I think it's interesting. I'm semi curious to go and even run that experiment now on something, like it's quite good to have something that's very time bounded in terms of what it absolutely knows, right? And sort of retest that theory. So, I mean, last couple of questions then. So, I'm kind of interested. So you're increasingly involved in sort of research and academia and cataloging new kinds of knowledge creating institutions. And we've spoken already about, some of this, the education that comes out and the knowledge that comes out of our institutions are sort of deigned to protect settled knowledge. Yet that knowledge keeps expiring. So what might, in the world we're living in now and everything else, and there's a big question this to end with, but what might the institutions of the next century look like? And how do we rethink those perhaps?
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting question. Certainly, the institutions we have and like the forms of research that we do right now, they shouldn't necessarily be like thrown away, but I definitely think we can do a lot more. Like when I kind of think about where research and innovation happens, people will say, oh, it can happen in like corporate industry labs, it can happen in universities, it can happen sometimes in like certain types of startups. But the truth is, like, those are just 3 points in some high dimensional space of potential organizational forms. And we should actually be exploring this high dimensional space a lot more. And so, and gratifyingly, over the past few years, there's been a lot of interesting new organizational research, like non-traditional research institutions, ones that maybe are much more like radically interdisciplinary, maybe are focused a little bit more on kind of longer term kind of research. And I definitely think those kinds of things are really, really important. For me, I would certainly love kind of like a certain amount of like more open-endedness or kind of playfulness when we kind of think about ideas. But ultimately, I'm kind of agnostic as to what the form of these institutions are going to take. I feel like we just need to run the experiment of actually trying to populate this high dimensional space much more. Which ones are going to win out? I don't know, but I think we need to do that because like for so long we've only had a relatively small set of institutional structures, and we need to actually try this. And it could very well be. And people talk about like how there's like a Cambrian explosion of new research institutions. Of course, like when you have a very large explosion of new forms in evolutionary biology, oftentimes it can be followed by an extinction event, and there might be that. But hopefully, on the other side, we will have learned about new institutional forms that are actually things that we should be using more of. And so, so I'm excited to see kind of where it goes, but I'm also fairly agnostic as to what are the specific forms, because I just think we need to try like almost like recombining all the different features of the things that we realize could be useful and just trying, like exploring this like combinatorial space of research institutions.
Yeah, I was going to say it feels like a combinatorial, recombinatorial, big experiment at the moment to see, as you said, like, and there probably will be a big extinction event, and maybe it reverts back to norm again, and that was always the best version. Although I have a sneaky feeling that we're entering a different paradigm, I think, from that angle now. We've spoken at length now, and time is ticking upon us. So as much as I have a whole load of other stuff I want to go on, I'm going to ask you my one final question I ask everybody in this podcast, which is, you've written 3 amazing books. I highly advocate people to go pick them up. I don't know whether they were ever planned to sort of follow each other sequentially in logic, or that just happened through life, but they do beautifully flow on from each other. And so I'll give you the benefit of strategic planning on that one over
Thank you. I appreciate that.
But I like to ask others. You've got a great bookcase behind you, and we always learn something interesting. So, is there one book that you would recommend to others that something new, something different, perhaps, that has either inspired you in your journey or surprised you, within the broad topics of knowledge, innovation, etc., etc.?
Yeah, I mean, and we've talked a little bit about kind of like complex systems and simulation. I think I even mentioned like when we're talking about like kind of like wonder and computing, I mentioned like I grew up with SimCity and things like that. There's actually this great book came out several years ago called Building SimCity by Chaim Gingold, who's also a friend. He's fantastic, and it's about the creation of the computer game SimCity, but also about the deep like intellectual prehistory. So not just like, and it includes like the nature of the game itself and the nature of the computer company Maxis, which created it, and like the history of that, but also this prehistory of like cellular automata and systems dynamics and like all these like deep ideas that were kind of recombined in this very novel and exciting way. And for me, I think about, I mean, is SimCity a very detailed model of of a city? No. But can it actually lead you to understand many, many things about urban planning, or even just simply to grapple with the unanticipated consequences and feedback of a complex system that kind of does things in a way that you don't anticipate? Yeah, it's really good at all these kinds of things. And so I love thinking about these kind of like simulation toys, these kind of like software with this kind of like little like like microcosm within it. And yeah, and this book is a really good window into kind of many, many ideas that kind of go into this kind of thing.
I love this question, and I agree. And I think SimCity, I don't know if it's hugely underrated, but I feel like it needs to just permeate every generation. It's such an important, as you said, simulation and concept for the system level of analysis. So brilliant, and a book I haven't read, and I must go and pick it up. I always commit to doing that as well. Sam, thank you so much. You have taken us through 3 books without us going too deep. I've pulled you back in your mind and consciousness over a decade or more, and from the first book as well. But I know it applies a lot to the work you're doing today and the work that you're doing across your sort of portfolio career at this point in time. It's been an honor having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for your time, for the details, for the sharing of the stories in a detailed and very charismatic way as well. So much appreciated. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Great. Where can people find more about you? Like, do you have a website or whatever?
Yeah, so my website, so arbesman.net, just my last name.net. There's lots of links to recent articles and things, and you can sign up for, I have a newsletter, as I think many people do nowadays. And so, yeah, you can sign up for there, and then that will, you'll be able to subscribe to my writings and musings about many of these ideas.
Yeah, they're great writings and great musings. So thank you very much. To everybody, as always, thank you very much. I know there's many podcasts out there for you to listen to. We appreciate all of our listeners, all of our subscribers. This has been another incredible episode. There's many more gone before. Please check those out. And we have many more exciting ones coming as well. Next up is a topic looking at failure and some incredible stories of failure over the years from another Sam, actually. So for today, thank you very much, Sam. Thank you, everybody. As always, I've been Simon Hill. This has been the Total Innovation Podcast. Goodbye.
What's a person?